Hello and welcome to the latest in our series on the superpower relations in the Cold War between 1941 and 1991, with our focus on key topic 1, the origins of the Cold War between 1941 and 1958. This session will look at part 2, which is the development of the Cold War. The key focus of today's content is looking at the impact on US-Soviet relations of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan in 1947, and along with the significance of the reactions to that regarding Common Form and Comecon, and also the formation of NATO in 1949. In addition, we will look at the idea of Berlin and how it was divided into zones, and the Berlin crisis, including the blockade and the airlift, and the formation of East and West Germany. First of all, we're going to be looking at the introduction of the Truman Doctrine. So the features of the Truman Doctrine is that it's part of the policy of containment of communism within Europe, and that America would provide assistance to help countries fight against communist takeovers. This was particularly seen within Greece and within Turkey. Greece at this point were in the middle of a civil war between government forces and the communist rebels, and within Turkey there was a potential political takeover by communists. It was successful in both of these countries by stopping communists taking over. In terms of the impact of the Truman Doctrine, this impacted on the development of the Cold War, as it showed that America would become involved in world affairs to prevent communism from spreading. Therefore, America is no longer being isolationist in its foreign policy. The second reason would be the idea that it provided an ideological viewpoint that communism would not be tolerated within the Western Hemisphere. A question could also come up on the idea of its impact on superpower relations. So the two key areas that you need to focus on here would be the idea that it does increase tensions as Stalin wished for communism to spread to other countries. And it also drew key battle lines between the two countries regarding the future of Europe. With regards to what this event links to, moving forwards, it links to the idea of the Marshall Plan, as it's another element of the policy of containment. It leads to Common Form as a reaction, as that was formed in response to the Truman Doctrine, and also the Carter Doctrine, whereby there are similar plans to contain communism in different parts of the world. So, for example, if the Carter Doctrine comes up, there are similarities in the features between Carter and Truman with regards to their doctrines, and both of them do plan to contain communism. The Truman Doctrine focuses on Western Europe, and the Carter Doctrine focuses on Afghanistan and the Middle East. So the next key event within this time period is the Marshall Plan of 1948, and the key features of this is that it was felt that it was required in order to stop communism from spreading and taking over countries in Europe. Again, kind of like the Truman Doctrine, but this was ensuring that there wasn't revolutions within countries that have been torn apart by World War II. So therefore, in order to do that, there was an economic stimulus package of 13 billion given to European countries in order to rebuild their infrastructure that was damaged by World War II fighting. So this was mainly given to countries such as West Germany, France, and also Great Britain. In terms of its impact, we can say that there were tensions between the former allies, i.e. the USA and the Soviet Union, these continue to grow as both wanted to be perceived as a greater power in Europe. So you've essentially got the communists trying to stimulate economic growth in Eastern Europe, and you've also got the Americans trying to stimulate economic growth in Western Europe. So they wanted to basically both be seen as resisting the other and doing more for the ordinary people of Europe. In terms of the idea of the future of Europe, it basically led to many countries deciding which camp they wanted to be in. So what you tended to find was that the Western Hemisphere countries would gravitate towards the Marshall Plan, and the Eastern European countries, although they didn't necessarily gravitate towards the Soviet Union, they were essentially taken over through the satellite states that we looked at in the previous episode. But the Eastern European countries were kind of pulled towards the Soviet Union itself. So in terms of what it links to, Comecon is essentially the Soviet reaction to the Marshall Plan, which we'll look at very, very shortly. And we've already mentioned this in the sense that it does link back to the satellite states, in that through Cominform, which we'll look at very, very shortly, is that the satellite states were instructed not to take up any funding from the Marshall Plan, and that was basically seen as a propaganda exercise. So, in terms of the Soviet reactions to the policy of containment, the first organization that was formed was Cominform. The features of this particular organization was the coordination of the communist parties within Europe, and it also was introduced to ensure that states in Eastern Europe followed the aims of Soviet foreign policy, and also introduced Soviet-style economic policies such as collectivization. In terms of its impact on Eastern Europe was that it was basically used to purge any members that disagreed with Moscow. So, for example, Tito in Yugoslavia. And there was also high levels of control and a complete lack of political and economic independence within the satellite states themselves. In terms of its impact on Europe as a whole, the key argument there is that it basically ends up splitting Europe into two camps based on their ideological viewpoint. So again, Western Europe went towards and gravitated towards America, and Eastern Europe gravitated towards the Soviet Union. In terms of the relationships between the superpowers, it's seen as a clear reaction to the policy of containment action by Truman, and this therefore leads to increased tensions between the two superpowers. In terms of its links, we're kind of linking backwards here on this one. So the Truman Doctrine, Cominform is the USSR's response to the policy of containment and seen as a show of strength against the West. And the Marshall Plan Cominform was used to inform satellite states not to take up the Marshall Plan. So in terms of Comecon, so this is the reaction to the Marshall Plan. So the features of this was that it was supposed to be a means by which the Soviet Union could financially support Eastern European countries. However, that did not necessarily happen. What basically happened was it increased the amount of control that the Soviet Union had over the economies of Eastern Europe. It gave the Soviet Union complete access to the resources within satellite states, particularly within countries that had quite a large amount of raw materials, particularly with regards to those on the east-west border, countries such as, for example, Czechoslovakia. It also encouraged specialization of certain economies. So Czechoslovakia is quite heavy with regards to its industry, and Bulgaria was quite specialized with regards to food and other raw materials. In terms of its impact, the key question here would be the idea of the impact on Eastern Europe, in the sense that it tightened the grip that the Soviet Union had on satellite states to control the economies of these countries, and therefore it meant that the satellite states were also now completely reliant on the USSR. In terms of its links, the only link that it links back to is the Marshall Plan, because this was the Soviet response to that in giving economic assistance to satellite states and keeping control of them and making sure they weren't persuaded to go to the Western countries. So now we move on to this all basically builds up to the Berlin crisis between 1948 and 49. So we're going to look at three different aspects here. We're going to look at the causes, the events, and the outcomes. So the causes of the event, we can split those into long-term causes and short-term causes. So the long-term cause would be the ideological differences in the strength of Germany after World War II. The idea that Berlin was situated in Soviet-controlled Germany with access by rail and road, and that Stalin realized the affluent capitalist West would be on show to East Berlin and therefore wanted them out. So the geographical location of Berlin in the eastern or in the Soviet-controlled eastern part of Germany meant that Stalin didn't have as much control as to what the East Berliners could see. Because of the idea that there was freedom of movement essentially in Berlin over this time, it basically meant that there was a corridor by which people that were living in East Berlin could travel to the West by going from East Berlin to West Berlin and then flying out. In terms of the short-term causes, the Western zones, both within wider Germany and West Berlin, received large amounts of Marshall aid. And in addition to that, the Western areas that were controlled by Britain, France, and Russia merged into one economic unit, which was called Bizonia, and they also introduced a new currency. This therefore led to the Berlin crisis. So the events themselves is the Berlin crisis basically splits into two at this point. So we've got the blockade itself, which is where Stalin blocks off the railroad and canal routes in order to starve West Berlin and to try and get the Western powers to withdraw from that particular area. And then you've got the airlift, which is essentially the Western response to the blockade. So essentially, Truman was determined to show that he was serious about the policy of containment and to stand up to Stalin with what he saw was as an act of aggression. So what happened was they essentially ended up flowing supplies in by air. There were airports situated within West Berlin where there were a number of flights a day that were carrying the key ingredients, the key produce in order to keep West Berliners alive. Now this blockade continued for around about 11 months, with Stalin calling off the airlift in May 1949 because it wasn't having a desired effect. Stalin didn't get the Western powers out of Berlin, and there was a huge amount of resistance from Western powers through the airlift against the blockade. So in terms of the impact of the Berlin crisis, is that it absolutely confirms the divisions of Germany and Berlin. So the Western Allies joined their zones together to create what is called the FRG, otherwise known as West Germany. And as a reaction to that, Stalin creates the GDR, which is otherwise known as East Germany. The other consequence is that it led to the creation of NATO, which we'll come on to very, very shortly. And it also, as another consequence, greatly increased the rivalry between East and West. So you've got Truman that believes that because of the blockade being called off, it is seen as a triumph for West over East, and therefore seen as a great victory. And for Stalin, it was seen as a humiliation. It was a propaganda disaster, essentially. However, the people that were living in East Germany or anywhere that was under Soviet control were led to believe that it was a victory for the USSR. So in terms of its links, it links to the formation of NATO because NATO was formed in response to the threat posed by the Soviet Union in Berlin and Western Europe. And it leads to the formation of East and West Germany as these two countries were formed in the aftermath of the Berlin crisis. So in terms of NATO, which is still around today and this has been quite important with regards to the war in Ukraine, the key features of this is that it's a mutual defensive assistance between Western countries. It's a military alliance and is designed to prevent an attack from the Soviet Union on any country within the Western Hemisphere. And so therefore one of the key aspects of NATO is that if you attack one, then you attack us all. So what that means is that if the Soviet Union were to invade West Berlin and to try and take it over, or they were to invade West Germany, then all the countries of NATO would then declare war on the Soviet Union. So it therefore shows kind of like a unified show of strength between the Western countries. So in terms of the impact of NATO on superpower relations, Stalin believed that it wasn't a defensive alliance. So NATO believed that it was defensive and not offensive. But Stalin believed that it was actually a load of countries coming together to provoke and to one day attack the Soviet Union. It also then leads to the Soviets, again, a reaction to a Western action. It leads to the Soviets setting up the Warsaw Pact, although this doesn't happen for another 6 years. But they do end up creating their own military alliance because of the formation of NATO. In terms of its impact on the development of the Cold War, you've got the fact that the USA is now committed to the defense of Western Europe, in that if any Western European country was invaded, were to be invaded, then the USA would be obliged under NATO to get involved. So it therefore, again, heightens their role in foreign policy, and it also intensifies the arms race with the development of more powerful weaponry. And we'll look at the development of the arms race when we look at part 3 of key topic 1. And so therefore, in terms of what NATO links to, the only real thing it really links to is linking backwards. It's linking to the Berlin crisis, as NATO was formed as a consequence of the Berlin crisis to prevent further expansion from the USSR. So to summarize for this particular episode, you've got quite a number of significant events over a short time period, which leads to the clear division between East and West based on ideological ideas. Essentially, each action that's taken by one side was then reacted to by the other. The Berlin crisis was the first conflict between the superpowers, and the USA still had the upper hand in terms of weaponry over the Soviets, in that they still had the monopoly on the atomic bomb, even though this was developed by the Soviet Union and tested by the Soviet Union by the end of 1949. That hereby ends this episode on the Cold War. The next episode will be on the raising tensions. Don't forget to like and subscribe.